cemeteries don't belong to visitors. They belong to the workers who stay after the gates lock. And when the ground has been opened enough times, it learns how to answer back. Tonight on Mr. Dark Horror Stories, these are true cemetery worker horror stories. Real encounters from people who didn't just see the dead, they were noticed by them. If you love realistic, deeply terrifying true horror where spirits come close, subscribe and hit the bell. Because tonight, something is standing behind you. Story 1. Fog changes a cemetery. In daylight, you can pretend it's just weather. Low cloud, damp air, the kind that beads on your jacket and turns stone dark. But in winter, when fog sits heavy and refuses to lift, the whole place stops feeling like a field with headstones and starts feeling like a room with the lights turned down. Sound doesn't travel normally. Distance doesn't look honest. Even your own footsteps seem hesitant. I've been a caretaker for years, and I'm not easily spooked. You don't last in the job if every creak or shadow gets under your skin. You learn routines and you stick to them. You check the locks, inspect the grounds, straighten what the wind knocks over. You treat the dead with respect and the living with patience. But there was one morning, one heavy winter morning, when the ground didn't behave like ground. It was still early, not quite full daylight, that pale gray hour where everything looks unfinished. A thick fog had rolled in overnight and settled over the cemetery like a blanket. The trees at the far end were half erased. Rows of stones faded into white after only a few meters. My breath showed in slow clouds. My radio crackled at my hip as I walked the main path, boots damp from wet grass. I'd been told to inspect a fresh grave, buried 48 hours earlier. Routine check. Sometimes soil settles after a burial, especially if it rained. Sometimes animals dig. Sometimes the ground dips and needs topping up before the family returns with flowers. The grave was in the newer section, near a line of young yew trees. I remember thinking, as I approached, that the fog was thicker there. Not across the whole cemetery, just that corner. The air looked heavier, like it had been poured into a bowl. I stopped a few steps away and stared. The soil was uneven. Not just slightly, noticeably. The center of the mound was sunken, creating a shallow depression like someone had pressed a weight into it. The edges were still raised, the way they are after a recent burial, but the middle looked tired, collapsing. My first thought was simple. The ground had settled more than expected. Maybe the coffin shifted, maybe the soil hadn't been packed properly. I stepped closer, planning to mark it for refill later. That's when I heard the breathing. At first, I thought it was my own. Fog can make you hear yourself too loudly. The cold makes your breath rasp. But this sound didn't match my rhythm. It came from beneath the grave. Slow, wet, strained breathing, like lungs working against resistance. Inhale, exhale, each one dragging slightly, as if the air had to be pulled through something narrow. I froze, my boot half lifted above the grass. The breathing continued, not imagined, not wind, not the subtle hiss of fog moving. It had a rhythm, a desperate human rhythm. My skin prickled. I stepped back one pace, then another. The cold seemed to tighten around my throat. The soil rose and fell, just slightly but visibly. The sunken center of the grave lifted on each inhale, then sank on each exhale, like a chest under a blanket. It wasn't dramatic movement, but it was unmistakable once you saw it. My stomach turned. I whispered, "No," without meaning to. Saying it out loud made it feel less real, like refusal could fix physics. The breathing grew faster. Panic entered it, subtle at first. Inhales shorter, exhales sharper. The soil began to pulse more noticeably, lifting and sinking with increasing urgency. I backed away another step, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would drown out everything. Then a voice came from underground, muffled, distorted by layers of earth and wood, but clear enough to understand. "It's too tight." The words hit me like a shove. My mouth went dry. I reached for my radio instinctively, thumb shaking over the button. "Control," I said, voice cracking. "This is Thomas. I'm at the news section, Grave Road D. Need." Static erupted, not the usual mild crackle. The radio snapped on at full volume by itself, blasting harsh static that made me flinch. I hadn't pressed anything. The knob hadn't moved. The sound spilled into the fog like a scream. Under the static, I heard sobbing, not faint, not imagined. A wet, broken crying woven into the noise, as if the radio had tuned into a frequency that didn't belong to any channel. It rose and fell, layered with the static, the kind of sobbing that comes from someone who can't catch breath between tears. My hands shook violently. I tried to turn the radio off. The switch resisted for a second, then clicked. The static died, the cemetery fell silent again, except for the grave. Breathing faster now. Soil pulsing like a trapped animal beneath a blanket. The fog thickened around it, curling low over the mound, as if the air itself wanted to hide what was happening. I heard scratching, fingernails scraping wood beneath the soil. That sound is something you can't mistake once you've heard it. A thin, rhythmic drag against a hard surface, pausing, then resuming. It wasn't random movement, it was purposeful, someone trying to find an edge, a seam, a weakness. My legs wanted to run. My body screamed that running was the only sane response. But another part of me, the part trained by responsibility, held me in place. You don't abandon a grave. You don't ignore something like that and walk away. I forced myself to speak again, louder into the fog, as if someone might appear and explain. "Who's there?" I called, voice shaking. "What is this?" The answer came immediately, muffled and strained. "It's too tight." The breathing turned frantic. The soil lifted higher with each inhale. The scratching became faster, more desperate, a flurry of nails against wood, and the fog, God, the fog, tightened around the mound until the rest of the cemetery felt distant. I could barely see the headstones 10 meters away. It was as if the grave existed inside its own pocket of weather. Then, all at once, the breathing stopped. No gradual easing, no final exhale, stopped. The soil went still. The pulsing ended mid-rise, leaving the mound frozen in quiet. The fog held for a long second, thick and unmoving, like the cemetery itself had paused to listen. I stood there trembling, waiting for the next sound, the scratch, the voice, the sobbing radio. Nothing came. I didn't approach again. I didn't touch the soil. I turned and walked quickly toward the maintenance shed, my boots sliding slightly on wet grass. I could feel my own breath now, loud and ragged. The fog swallowed my path behind me. I called the supervisor as soon as I reached the shed. My words tumbled out wrong. I didn't say breathing under the ground. I said subsidence and possible collapse and urgent check needed. I wrapped panic in practical language because that was the only way to make it sound believable. By the time anyone came with me, 2 staff, 1 gravedigger, the fog had thinned slightly. The grave looked normal. Still uneven, yes, but quiet. No movement, no sound. They probed the soil, checked the edges, discussed settlement. They didn't dig. There was no authority to disturb a fresh burial without official cause. And what cause could I offer without sounding insane? They told me to mark it, and we'd top it up the next day. They told me I'd probably heard wind through the yew trees. They told me the radio was faulty. I nodded and went home, sick with dread. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing that muffled voice in my head, the way it sounded through earth. It's too tight. The next morning, I returned earlier than usual, unable to stop myself. Fog still hung in patches, thinner now, but the cemetery was quiet. The grave was perfectly smooth. Not settled, not a bit more even. Perfectly level, as if someone had carefully raked and packed it in the night. The edges were neat. The depression was gone. The mound looked as tidy as it had the day after burial. My stomach dropped. I went straight to the burial logs. There was an entry for the service, a delivery record, a notation about the coffin arriving on schedule. Then a line I had never seen before, written in a different hand. Coffin delivered empty. I read it 3 times, convinced I was misunderstanding. Empty? That made no sense. There had been a funeral. There had been a family. There had been a casket at the chapel. There had been a burial. I took the log to the office and asked quietly. The supervisor's face tightened. Not confusion, recognition. He didn't answer my questions directly. He only said, "Don't start digging into old paperwork. It'll make your life harder." "What does it mean?" I asked, my voice low. "Empty?" He held my gaze for a moment and then looked away. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "things get delivered that aren't what the paperwork says. Sometimes we're told not to ask." I left the office shaking. I never got an official explanation. No one wanted to speak it into existence. The cemetery continued functioning. Families came. Grief moved through rooms. The grounds were maintained. The world carried on as if the earth hadn't breathed. But I changed. Now, whenever fog settles thick and close, I can't stand still too long. If I stop walking, if I pause in white silence, I start to hear it. Breathing, not my own. Slow, wet, strained breathing just behind me, matching my pace when I move and stopping when I stop. Like something in the fog has learned how to follow without being seen. And every time I feel that wrong stillness in the air, I remember the soil rising and falling like lungs under pressure. I remember the muffled voice beneath the ground. It's too tight. And I walk faster because some graves don't stay quiet. They wait for the fog to make enough room for them to be heard again. Story 2. Section C was the part of the cemetery everyone pretended didn't exist. Not officially. On paper it was still there. Rows, plots, a maintenance schedule, a gate that was supposed to stay locked after sunset. But among watchmen and caretakers it had a different status. People avoided talking about it the way you avoid talking about a family argument that never truly ended. If the supervisor assigned you that patrol route, you didn't argue directly. You just found excuses to delay. You walked faster through that section, you didn't stop. I was new enough to think the warnings were exaggeration. That's what happens when you start a night job with a little pride in your chest. You want to prove you're reliable. You want to be the one who doesn't get scared by stories. I was a night watchman, doing rounds through the cemetery grounds, checking locks, making sure no one was sneaking in after dark. In Pakistan, you'd think the cold wouldn't be the problem, but winter nights have their own bite, especially in open places where wind moves freely and stone holds the chill. That night, the sky was foggy and low, the kind of fog that doesn't drift but hangs, thick and flat, swallowing distance. The cemetery lights were dim, old bulbs that cast weak circles on the paths. Beyond those circles, everything turned to gray. My patrol started normal: main gate, office door, storage shed, then the walkway that led towards Section C. The gate to Section C was chained, as always. I checked it with my flashlight, tugged it once to confirm it held, and made a note on my clipboard like I'd been trained. Then I saw the lantern. A single, warm light moving between headstones. Not electric, not a flashlight beam. A lantern glow, amber and soft, swaying gently as if it were being carried by a hand. It floated deeper inside Section C, just visible through the bars of the gate and the fog. I stood there for several seconds, blinking, trying to correct what my eyes were seeing. If the gate was locked, no one should be inside. And even if someone had climbed in, they wouldn't bring a lantern. They'd bring a phone, a torch, something modern. The light moved again, slow and steady, weaving between stones as if it knew the paths. My first thought was practical. Trespasser. Thieves sometimes enter cemeteries, metal from fences, anything that can be sold. Sometimes people come for darker reasons. Whatever it was, my job was to stop it. I raised my voice. "Who's there?" The lantern stopped instantly, not slowed, stopped. The way an animal freezes when it hears a branch snap. My skin prickled. I waited, expecting a reply, a curse. Footsteps running. The sound of someone climbing out. Nothing. The lantern began moving again, not away from me, deeper. But it moved as if inviting me to follow, pulling forward through fog like a guide light. I stared at the chain on the gate. It was locked. The padlock sat, heavy and intact. Then, without me touching it, the gate gave a small metallic shift. The chain loosened slightly, just enough that the gate could move an inch. I stepped back, heart pounding. The metal didn't creak like forced movement. It loosened like someone had unlocked it from the other side. Impossible. But the physics of the moment didn't care about my disbelief. The lantern kept moving. My mouth went dry. I told myself this was still a job. Still a simple explanation. Maybe the caretaker had left the gate improperly chained. Maybe someone had a key. Maybe I was about to catch someone doing something illegal and I needed to stay calm. I pushed the gate open. It swung inward smoothly, silently, as if it had been waiting for that. The air in Section C felt different the moment I stepped through. Colder. Not just the normal drop you feel entering a shadowed area. This was a sharp, unnatural cold that pressed against my face and slipped under my jacket. My breath turned, visible in thin puffs, and the fog thickened around me, closing in so quickly that the gate behind me became a vague outline. I kept my flashlight up, but the beam felt weak in that fog, swallowed after a few feet. The lantern remained ahead, the only warm color in a world of gray. I followed. At first, my footsteps sounded normal on the gravel path. Crunch, crunch. Then, gradually, the sound faded. Not because I stepped softer, because the ground stopped responding. My boots still moved, but the sound disappeared as if the earth had patted itself. I stopped walking abruptly, testing it. Silence. I lifted my foot and stomped once. No sound. My chest tightened. Sound doesn't just vanish, not like that. It felt like the fog was swallowing it, or like I'd stepped into a place where noise wasn't allowed. The lantern swayed ahead patiently, waiting. I swallowed, forced my legs to move again, and continued deeper into the section. The headstones here were older, many without clear names. Some were leaning, some sunk into the ground. The fog clung low around their bases, making them look like they floated. The air smelled damp and metallic, like wet stone. The lantern led me past rows I didn't recognize. Section C wasn't large, but in that fog, the paths stretched longer than they should have. The cemetery didn't feel like a map anymore. It felt like a maze designed to keep you walking. "Stop!" I called out, voice trembling despite my effort. "Show yourself." The lantern paused again, then resumed moving, slower now, as if it was being considerate. A cold thought entered my mind. What if it's not leading me to a trespasser? What if it's leading me somewhere it wants me to be? I tried to turn around, I truly did. I stopped and pivoted, aiming my flashlight toward where I believed the gate was. Fog, just fog and blurred stones. The path behind me looked unfamiliar, curved in a way I didn't remember walking. My stomach dropped. The lantern's glow was still ahead, steady and warm, like a heartbeat. I followed it because I didn't know where else to go. After a few more minutes, the lantern stopped beside an unmarked grave. No stone, no name. Just a patch of earth slightly raised, darker than the surrounding ground, as if it had been disturbed recently. Fog pooled over it like breath over cold glass. The lantern hovered directly above that patch. The light lifted higher, rising gently, as if the invisible hand holding it had raised an arm. And then I saw the truth. There was no one holding it, no silhouette, no sleeve, no body standing behind the glow. Just the lantern light itself suspended in fog, swaying slightly as if it still obeyed a hand that didn't exist. My heart hammered so hard it made my vision pulse. I stepped back, nearly tripping over a sunken stone. The ground beneath the unmarked grave cracked. Not splitting wide, not opening like a movie. A thin fissure formed, just enough for darkness to show beneath, the soil. The crack widened a fraction, releasing a colder air that made my breath catch. A voice whispered. Not from the crack alone, from everywhere at once. From the stones, the fog, the air behind my ear. "You're late for the walk." The words hit me with a strange sense of familiarity, as if they'd been said to me before in a dream I couldn't recall. I shook my head violently. "No," I whispered. "No, no." The fog shifted around me, thickening, and shadows began forming between the graves. Not solid people, not yet. Shapes at first. Tall outlines standing still, spaced out like a gathering. Their edges blurred like smoke, but their presence felt heavy and intentional. More shadows appeared, one after another, until I realized I was no longer alone in that section. I turned my flashlight in a frantic circle. The beam caught nothing clearly. The shadows didn't reflect light the way normal bodies do. They remained just beyond the beam's reach, as if they understood where illumination ended. Then something grabbed my ankle from behind. An icy hand, human in shape, wrapped around my boot with sudden strength. Fingers dug in, cold enough that it burned through leather. The grip was not gentle, it was possessive. I screamed, at least I tried to. No sound came out. My mouth opened, my chest tightened, but the cemetery swallowed the scream the way it had swallowed my footsteps. I stumbled forward, dragging my trapped leg. The hand tightened, pulling me backward toward the crack in the ground. I felt my balance break. Panic surged hot and useless. The lantern dropped. It fell straight down into the fissure like a stone into water, and its warm glow vanished instantly, swallowed by darkness. The world turned colder and darker, as if that light had been the only thing keeping something away. The shadows around me leaned closer. I felt breath at the back of my neck. Cold, damp, patient. Then the grip on my ankle released. So abruptly, I nearly fell forward. I didn't wait to understand why. I ran, or I tried to. At first, my legs moved, but the ground didn't cooperate, like running through heavy water. Then, suddenly, sound returned, my boots crunching gravel loudly, my breath tearing out of my throat, my heartbeat roaring. The fog broke in patches as I ran blindly between stones, following instinct rather than paths. I didn't care about direction, I cared about distance. Somewhere ahead, the outline of the gate appeared like a miracle. I slammed into it, pushed it open, and spilled out into the main section of the cemetery where lights were dim but real. The chain was back in place, locked. I stared at it, shaking, unable to understand how it could be locked when I had just come through it. My hands trembled too badly to touch the padlock. I didn't finish my shift. I walked straight to the watch office, grabbed my things and left before anyone could ask questions. In the morning, I returned with daylight and another guard, desperate to prove to myself that fog and fear had distorted everything. Section C was sealed, chain tight, lock intact, gate unmoved. But something new stood just inside the fence line, visible through the bars. A grave marker, fresh stone, pale against the older markers as if it had been placed overnight. No flowers, no dirt around it. Just a clean marker standing upright where there had been nothing before. I couldn't read the name from where I stood. The fog was gone, and yet the stone still looked slightly blurred, like my eyes refused to focus on it. The older guards wouldn't go in. They saw my face and didn't ask questions. One of them only said quietly, "You saw the light, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. No one patrols Section C now. It's not official policy. It's something closer to survival. If management asks, they say the lock is faulty, the section is unsafe, the ground is unstable. On foggy nights, people still see a lantern light moving between the headstones. Always one warm glow. Always swaying as if carried by a hand. Always waiting, patient, steady, near the gate, like it remembers the ones who followed before. Story 3. Night burials were never supposed to happen. That's what the older men told me when I first started working as a gravedigger. Cemeteries had hours for a reason, they said. Dirt behaved differently after dark. Sound carried wrong, and if something went unfinished, it remembered. I laughed back then. I was younger, stronger, and needed the money. When a delayed burial came up, paperwork issues, family disputes, weather delays, I volunteered. Extra pay, fewer people watching, just me, my tools, and the ground. The night the bell rang for me was cold and wet, the kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as cling. The clouds hung low, pressing darkness down into the cemetery until the headstones looked like crooked teeth pushing through black gums of earth. The burial had already been postponed twice. The family insisted it be completed that night before another day passed. Management agreed. I was sent alone. The cemetery bell stood at the far end of the grounds, mounted on a wooden frame near the old chapel. It was ceremonial, only rung during funerals, never at night, never without people. Everyone knew that. The rope was kept tied up when not in use. I didn't look at it when I arrived. I focused on the open grave in front of me, the dark rectangle waiting patiently. Rain had softened the edges. The dirt was heavy, clinging to my shovel like it didn't want to be moved again. I started filling. There's a rhythm to the work. Scoop, lift, drop, scoop, lift, drop. It becomes almost meditative if you let it. I was halfway through when I heard the bell, one clear ring. Not loud, not distant, close enough that I felt it vibrate through my chest. I froze, shovel suspended midair. There was no wind. The rain fell straight down. And I was alone. I told myself it was old wood settling, metal shifting. Cemeteries are full of things that creak and groan if you listen too closely. Then the bell rang again, louder, closer. This time, there was no mistaking it. The sound rolled across the graves, echoing between stones, announcing itself the way bells do when they want to be heard. My throat tightened. I slowly turned toward the chapel. A man stood beside the bell. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't seen anyone approach. One moment, the space was empty. The next, it wasn't. He was soaked, not just wet from rain, but coated. Mud streaked his clothes, clung to his sleeves, smeared across his chest like he'd been pulled through the ground instead of walking over it. His face was swollen, bloated in a way I'd only ever seen on bodies left too long in water or earth. His eyes were sunken deep into dark hollows, staring at me with a calm that made my skin crawl. His hand wrapped around the bell rope. It wasn't shaking, it wasn't weak, it looked practiced. "They didn't finish mine either," he said. His voice was steady, not angry, not sad, just matter-of-fact, like he was explaining a scheduling mistake. Behind me, the ground shifted. I felt it through my boots before I heard it, the soft, awful sound of earth giving way. I turned back toward the grave just in time to see the sides collapsing inward. Dirt slid down in thick waves, filling space that had already been filled once. Then hands pushed through. Not one. Several. Gray fingers broke the surface, clawing, grasping, tearing at the soil like it was water holding them back. Nails scraped against stone, wrists twisted at wrong angles. More hands followed, reaching from different points, as if the grave wasn't one hole, but many trying to become one. The bell rang again, not once, not twice. It rang violently, swinging on its own, the rope snapping back and forth like something unseen was yanking it with urgency. The sound shattered the quiet, ringing so hard it hurt my ears, vibrating through bone and teeth. The man by the bell didn't move. He watched me. "Don't leave it unfinished," he said calmly, even as the bell screamed above him. I dropped my shovel. I ran. I didn't think about dignity. I didn't think about protocol. I ran between headstones, slipping in mud, breath tearing out of my chest in panicked gasps. The bell followed me, its sound chasing me through the rows, ringing and ringing like it was counting my steps. I didn't stop running until I reached the gate. I didn't look back. I didn't return that night. The next morning, management called me in. They looked pale, tired. They told me several graves had been inspected at dawn. Not just the one I'd been working on, older ones that should have been settled and silent. Remains were missing. Not disturbed, missing. As if they'd never been there at all. The burial I'd been assigned was marked incomplete. The coffin wasn't where it was supposed to be. The ground looked freshly turned, then smoothed over again, neat as if someone had taken pride in it. No one asked me to explain what happened. They didn't need to. The bell rope was found untied. Since then, I don't work cemeteries anymore. I won't step foot on those grounds after sunset. I don't attend funerals if I can avoid them. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed and the world is quiet enough, I hear it. One bell, close, not loud, not distant, ringing just for me. And every time, I know exactly what it's asking. Story 4. I didn't hear the crying right away. At first, it was just another workday sound. Wind passing through hedges, leaves brushing against each other, the steady snip of my shears cutting back overgrowth. I had been working grounds for years, long enough that my mind often drifted while my hands did the job. Cemeteries become familiar if you let them. You learn which paths flood after rain, which stones lean a little more each winter, which sections people avoid without ever saying why. The children's burial section was one of those places. I never volunteered to work there, but I never refused either. It felt wrong to avoid it. The headstones were small, some no bigger than bricks, some worn smooth until names were barely readable. A few had toys beside them, plastic cars bleached white by sun, dolls missing eyes, ribbons stiff with age. Most had nothing at all. That morning, fog hung low enough to brush my knees. The hedges bordering the path had grown uneven, and I was trimming them back slowly, careful not to scatter clippings onto the stones. That's when I noticed the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the wrong kind. Birds had stopped calling. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. The shears sounded too loud in my hands, so I paused. That's when I heard it. Crying. Soft. Thin. Exhausted. It came from behind me. I turned slowly, expecting to see a child who'd wandered in with family from another section. That happened sometimes. Kids slipping away while adults were distracted by grief. But there was no family. No adults. Just a small barefoot child standing between the headstones. He couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. His skin had a gray-blue tint, like cold water had never left it. His clothes hung wrong on his body, too loose in some places, too tight in others, like they didn't belong to the same child anymore. His feet were bare against the damp ground, toes dark with soil. His eyes were sunken, shadowed, too deeply for a living child. He wasn't sobbing loudly. He looked tired of crying, like he'd been doing it for a very long time. I felt my chest tighten. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice softer than I meant it to be. He looked up at me slowly. "Yes," he said. His voice was quiet, careful. "Can you help me find my name?" Something about the way he said it made my stomach drop. Not my parents, not my house. My name. I glanced around instinctively, searching for an adult, a caretaker, anyone who could explain why a child was standing barefoot in that section of the cemetery. There was no one. Your name should be on a stone," I said gently, gesturing around us. "Do you know where?" Before I could finish, the air changed. A whisper brushed past my ear, then another, then dozens. I turned toward the nearest row of headstones. The names were whispering. Not one voice, but hundreds layered together. Children's names spoken softly, urgently, overlapping, until I couldn't separate them. Some sounded clear. Others were distorted, half-formed, like the stones themselves were struggling to remember. My knees weakened. The headstones began to vibrate. Not shaking violently, just a low tremor that traveled through the ground and up into my legs. Dust fell from old carvings. A toy car toppled over with a soft plastic click. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the whispering didn't fade. It felt like it was inside my skull now. The child smiled. His neck bent slightly as he did it, just a little too far, like something inside wasn't aligned properly. Bone shouldn't move that way. "They're trying to help," he said calmly. I backed away, my heel catching on a stone. "Stop," I whispered. "Please." He stepped closer. Up close, I could see that his lips were faintly cracked, like they'd been dry for years. His eyes reflected nothing. Not fog, not stones, not me. "My name isn't here," he said. "None of ours are." He reached out and grabbed my wrist. His hand was ice cold. Not cold like winter air, cold like metal left outside overnight. The grip was far stronger than it should have been, fingers digging into my skin with painful certainty. I gasped and tried to pull away, but he held on easily. "They forgot us," he whispered, leaning closer. His breath smelled like damp earth. "They put us here and didn't finish." The whispering from the headstones rose, hundreds of voices speaking at once now, filling the fog with pleading, confusion, anger. Names repeated themselves. Some broke apart halfway through. Some were only sounds, not words anymore. I yanked my arm back with all the strength I had. The child's fingers slipped free. I didn't wait to see his expression change. I ran. I ran past the hedges, past older stones, past the path that led back to the main grounds. I didn't stop until my lungs burned and my vision blurred. When I finally turned around, the fog swallowed the children's section completely. There was no sign of him, no footprints, no crying. Just silence again, heavy, deliberate. I reported what happened that afternoon. I didn't say ghost, I didn't say child. I said I felt unwell, that I thought I'd heard voices, that maybe the fog and stress had gotten to me. They nodded too quickly. Later, when I asked about the children's section, about missing markers, unmarked graves, the office fell quiet. An older supervisor finally sighed and pulled out a ledger so old the pages felt brittle. Decades ago, there had been an outbreak. Illness, poverty, too many deaths, too quickly. Children buried without individual markers, group plots, temporary records that were never corrected, names written down once, then forgotten. They did what they could, the supervisor said, not meeting my eyes. I stopped working near that section, but it didn't stop there. Sometimes, when I'm trimming hedges elsewhere, I hear crying again, soft, distant, like it's being careful not to scare me. Sometimes I feel small fingers brush my sleeve, just enough to make fabric shift. And every time I pause too long, standing still in the fog, I hear a quiet voice near my ear. "Do you remember my name now?" I never answer, because I'm afraid if I do, I'll start hearing all of them again, and this time, they won't let me run. Story 5. I used to work nights because they were predictable. During the day, cemeteries are full of interruptions. Families asking questions, supervisors checking schedules, visitors who don't know where they're allowed to walk. At night, especially after closing hours, the work becomes simple. Clean paths, clear debris, lock sheds, go home. I wasn't brave, I wasn't spiritual. I just needed steady work, and night shifts paid slightly better. The rain had ended before I arrived that evening. Not a gentle rain either. A hard, soaking storm that left everything heavy and dark. My boots sank slightly into the grass as I crossed the gate, and the smell of wet soil clung to the air in a way that made breathing feel thicker than usual. I unlocked the caretaker's shed, set my tools inside, and stood for a moment listening. No voices, no footsteps, just water dripping from leaves and distant traffic beyond the cemetery walls. Normal. I started where I always did, main paths first, then the newer graves. After heavy rain, the fresh plots sometimes needed attention. Soil shifts, edges soften. My supervisor hated uneven ground, said it looked disrespectful. I worked slowly, methodically, sweep, rake, clear mud from the stone bases. The cemetery lights cast dull yellow circles that didn't quite touch each other, leaving long shadows between headstones. Time passed without incident. That's why, when I eventually noticed the footprints, they didn't register as wrong right away. At first, they were just mud marks in my peripheral vision. Dark impressions cutting across the grass near the newer section. I assumed another worker had passed through earlier and made a mess during the storm. I finished clearing a nearby path before walking closer. That's when I realized the direction was wrong. The footprints weren't heading toward the graves. They were leading away from them. I stopped and stared at the nearest set. The print was clear, heel, arch, toes, all pressed deeply into the wet ground. It wasn't smeared or dragged. Whoever made it had put their full weight down. Then another print followed. Then another. They rose directly beside a fresh grave, not overlapping the mound but starting at its edge, as if someone had stepped up from ground level and walked forward. I felt a flicker of unease but told myself not to overthink it. Rain distorts impressions, soil shifts, people see patterns where none exist. Still, I followed them. The prints moved in a straight line across the grass, weaving between stones without hesitation. They didn't slip, they didn't pause, they didn't wander, they were purposeful. As I walked, I noticed something else. There were no footprints going the opposite direction, nothing leading into the graves, nothing circling them, just clean, rising paths that began at the earth and continued forward. I checked another grave nearby, same thing. My throat tightened. I laughed, quietly to myself, short, forced. "Enough," I muttered. "It's mud." But my pace slowed anyway. The footprints led toward the caretaker's shed. My shed. I didn't like that. The closer I got, the darker the impressions became, as if the mud was fresher there, wetter. Drops of water still filled the deeper grooves, trembling slightly when I stepped nearby. The shed light was on. I knew I hadn't left it on. I stopped a few meters away, heart beating faster now, listening. The rain had stopped completely, but inside the silence I heard something else. Breathing. Wet, slow, uneven. It wasn't loud, but it was close enough that I felt it more than heard it, like humidity gathering in the air. The sound came from inside the shed. My hand hovered near the door handle. "Hello?" I called, keeping my voice steady. "Is someone there?" The breathing continued. I told myself it could be an animal. Stray dogs sometimes slipped in. Rats got bold after storms. I pulled the shutter open quickly, ready to shout or jump back. The light flickered. The shed was empty. No animal, no person. Just my tools hanging neatly, broom leaning against the wall, muddy floor marked with footprints. Footprints that hadn't been there before. They were everywhere now, smeared across the concrete floor, pressed against the walls, climbing upward at strange angles, as if hands had been placed there too. The door slammed shut behind me. The sound cracked through the shed like a gunshot. I spun around and grabbed the handle, yanking it hard. It didn't budge. The breathing grew louder, right behind me. I turned slowly. The mud on the floor began to move, not sliding, gathering. It pulled itself upward in thick, dripping strands, shaping into something tall and vaguely human. Soil clung together where a chest should be, water running down its surface in dark rivulets. Its face was hollow, eyes nothing but deep pits, mouth a stretched gap that didn't fully close. It stepped forward. No footprints formed beneath it. "We walk when you clean," it said. The voice sounded layered, like many mouths speaking through one shape. My legs locked. "You loosen the ground," it continued calmly. "You make room." Muddy handprints appeared on the walls beside me, forming one by one as if invisible bodies were pressing forward, surrounding the shed. I felt the air thicken, cold and damp, pressing against my chest. The figure took another step. I didn't think anymore. I grabbed the metal rake beside me and swung it at the window. The glass shattered outward, spraying rain-soaked grass with shards. Cold air rushed in, breaking the pressure around me. I climbed through, cutting my arm on the frame, and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the main gate and burst through it, breath tearing out of my lungs. I didn't return that night. In the morning, the footprints were gone. The graves looked normal, smooth, undisturbed. No marks leading anywhere. The shed floor was clean, dry, untouched. But the ground around the newer plots sat slightly open now, not broken, not collapsed, just unsettled. as if something beneath had shifted upward and then sunk back down again. I quit night work within a week. I still hear rain differently now. Heavy rainfall doesn't sound like water anymore. It sounds like movement. Like footsteps pacing just out of sight, waiting for the ground to soften again. And sometimes when I walk too slowly after a storm, I swear I hear something behind me, breathing wetly, patient enough to wait for me to stop. Story 6. The Final Count. I kept my retirement date on a sticky note for months. Not because I needed the reminder. Because I liked seeing it every morning when I unlocked the office. Proof that the job had an ending. That I wasn't going to die behind a desk with cemetery maps rolled under my arm. 40 years is a long time to spend counting the dead. People assume the registrar's work is paperwork. And it is. Forms, permits, plot assignments, transfers, exhumations, cemetery plans that change as new sections are opened and older ones are closed. But the truth is, the job is also memory. You remember where families are buried. You remember which graves sink after winter. You remember whose headstone took 6 months to arrive because the stone company went bankrupt. You remember the workers who started strong and left quietly after one bad season. When you do it long enough, the cemetery stops feeling like a place you visit and starts feeling like a system that knows you. That's why I insisted on doing the final count myself. The municipality had already assigned my replacement. A younger woman, efficient, polite, eager. She offered to help, but I refused. Not rudely, just firmly. This was my closure, my last clean ledger. I wanted to leave the records perfect, so no one could say Elena left a mess. The final count was simple on paper. Confirm the number of occupied plots in each section, cross-check with the registry, verify any unmarked entries, sign off, and archive the report. Simple, until it wasn't. The numbers didn't match. I noticed it the way you notice a loose thread on clothing. Small at first, then impossible to ignore. Section A matched. Section B matched, Section C matched, the new extension matched, but the total always came out one over, one extra grave. Not a rounding error, not an old map misprint. One physical plot existed that the registry didn't recognize. I checked again, then again, more slowly, using different pages, different methods. I ran my finger along the ledger lines, counted tallies twice, cross-referenced permits. Every time, the result remained stubbornly the same. One extra grave. It wasn't the first time I'd seen odd discrepancies over the years, but those always had explanations. An unrecorded infant burial from decades earlier. A grave moved during a renovation without paperwork. A headstone placed in the wrong location. We corrected them. We made the paper match reality. This didn't correct. The extra plot wasn't on any map, it didn't have a name, it didn't exist on paper, and yet my count insisted it did. Like the cemetery itself was insisting. I should have stopped there. I should have handed the problem to the municipality and let it become someone else's headache. But I'm not built that way. I took my coat and keys and drove to the cemetery just before dusk. Winter evenings come early in Italy, the light draining out fast. The sky was the color of steel, and the air had that dry cold that makes stone feel sharper. When I unlocked the side gate, the cemetery was empty. No visitors, no workers, no voices. Only the faint rustle of cypress branches and the distant sound of traffic beyond the wall. I walked with my clipboard tucked under my arm, following the path my own memory suggested. If there was an extra grave, it would be in one of the older sections. The places where records were handwritten before computers, where mistakes could hide for decades. But as I moved deeper, I realized I wasn't really choosing the route. My feet were. I turned left where I didn't intend to, then right. Then followed a narrower path that I hadn't used in years. The stones here were older, darker. Some names were worn into near invisibility. The ground felt softer beneath my boots, damp despite the cold. I stopped in a small clearing between rows and saw it. An unmarked plot. No headstone, no flowers, no border stones, just a rectangle of soil slightly raised and too neat to be natural. It looked recently tended, though no one had mentioned it, and no records indicated a new burial. I stared at it and felt something tighten in my chest. The soil was warm, not less cold than expected. Warm, like sunlight had soaked into it, except it was dusk, and the sun hadn't touched this shaded corner all day. I crouched and placed my gloved hand close to the ground. Even through the glove, I felt heat rising faintly, like breath from beneath earth. I stood quickly, disturbed by the instinctive feeling that I'd leaned too close to something alive. "Who's here?" I asked, and immediately hated myself for speaking aloud. Cemeteries make people do that, talk into silence as if silence might answer. The air shifted. A whisper brushed against my ears. So faint at first I thought it was wind sliding through branches. Then it gathered, tightening into something more deliberate. It said my name. Elena. I froze. The sound didn't come from one direction. It came from the ground, from the stones, from the space just behind my shoulders. It was not loud, but it was intimate, like someone speaking close enough to make your skin rise. "Elena," it repeated, softer. My mouth went dry. My hands tightened around the clipboard until the edges dug into my palms. I backed away a step. The soil seemed to settle, then rise again, a subtle swell like a chest drawing breath. I turned my head sharply, scanning the cemetery. Figures stood between the headstones. At first, they looked like shadows aligned by coincidence, tall shapes in dark coats, still and silent. Then my eyes adjusted, and my stomach dropped. They were people, or they looked like people enough for my mind to recognize them. Former workers, former caretakers, men who had carried shovels in winter, a woman who used to sweep the chapel steps every morning. Faces I hadn't seen in years. Because they'd retired, moved away, died, they stood in a loose circle around the unmarked plot, spaced evenly between graves, all facing me. None of them moved, none blinked. Their eyes held the same dull focus, like people staring through fog at something they can't fully see. My throat tightened. "This isn't funny," I whispered, though no one had ever accused me of believing in jokes here. One figure stepped forward, a man in an old caretaker's coat, the kind we used decades ago, dark wool, heavy collar. His face was pale, as if winter had drained it permanently. His mouth moved, and when he spoke, his voice sounded both near and far, like it traveled through soil before reaching my ears. "You're finally staying." I shook my head, backing away again. "No," I said, "I'm retiring." The man didn't smile, but something tightened at the corners of his mouth, like recognition. "That's what we all said," he replied. The ground beneath my feet softened. It wasn't sudden collapse, it was gradual, like stepping onto wet sand that begins to give. My boot sank an inch, then another. The soil felt warm against my soles, heat pressing upward like the earth was breathing under me. I tried to step back, but my foot stuck, held by suction. Hands grabbed my ankles, cold hands, not rough soil, not roots. Hands, fingers wrapping tightly around bone with human grip. Nails pressed through my trousers. The touch was ice and strength, and it pulled downward with steady patience. I screamed. The sound tore out of me before I could stop it, echoing off stone and cypress. The figures around me didn't react. They watched like witnesses at a ceremony. I kicked hard, tearing my boot free from the soft earth. The hands tightened, dragging me down another inch. I dropped the clipboard and fell backward, grabbing at a nearby headstone to steady myself. My fingers scraped cold marble. I pulled, desperate, ignoring pain. The hands slipped for a moment. Just enough. I yanked my legs free and stumbled away, nearly falling again as the soil tried to cling. My breath came in violent bursts. My heart pounded like it wanted to break my ribs. Behind me, the whispering rose again, layered voices saying my name. Elena, Elena. The unmarked plot pulsed faintly, as if something beneath it shifted, adjusting for my escape. I ran through the cemetery like I'd never belonged there, weaving between stones, slipping on damp grass, not caring which path led out as long as it led away. The light was fading fast, dusk turning to deep gray. The gate appeared ahead like salvation. I fumbled with the lock, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the keys. When it finally opened, I stumbled into the street and kept moving until the cemetery wall was behind me. I sat in my car shaking, tears cold on my face. I didn't return the next day. I didn't return the day after. I retired immediately. I told the municipality it was health, stress, age, something believable. My replacement began early and I refused to meet her in person. I couldn't step through that gate again. The cemetery had taken my years. I wouldn't give it my body, too. A week later, my replacement called. Her voice sounded cautious. "Elena, I finished the counts," she said. "Everything matches." My stomach tightened. "Everything?" "Yes," she said. "No discrepancies, no extra plot." I swallowed. "Are you sure?" She paused. "There was an unmarked grave before," she admitted, "but it isn't unmarked now." My hands went numb. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then said quietly, "There's a small stone there, very plain, and the name on it is faint, like it was carved lightly." I didn't ask which name. I knew. I hung up and sat in silence, listening to my own breath, suddenly aware of how fragile it sounded. Warm air from my heater felt foreign, like comfort I didn't deserve. I still drive past the cemetery sometimes on the road that skirts its wall. I don't look directly at the gates. I don't stop. I don't let my mind linger there. But on winter evenings, when light drains early and fog settles over the street, I sometimes catch myself whispering a promise without meaning to. Not to the dead, not to myself. To the ground that learned my name so well it started practicing it. That I'm not coming back. Those were very scary, true cemetery worker horror stories. Not stories of seeing ghosts from a distance, but of being noticed by them. Which one made you feel like something was close? Tell me in the comments. And remember, if you ever work where people are buried, listen carefully when the ground answers. This is Mr. Dark Horror Stories signing off.